Okay, so here we go. Just this is a nice, pretty picture for, you know, late October or early November. There's some greenery out there. That was a few years back. That was a mixture of 4010 spring pea and oat seeded the first week of September after harvesting sunflowers. So for background, like Ty said, I'm 10 years in farming organically with organic grains, but the farm has been organic or almost there for a lot longer. And I've got map of the state of Illinois. The blue dot at the north edge of LaSalle County there is me. I'm pretty much halfway between Chicago and Quad Cities, Iowa area there, just a little bit north of Interstate 80 as a reference. So as kind of start for why plant cover crops? The thing that started me there was to get some extra grazing forage. In 2012 had some winter wheat and extremely dry summer. The plan was to August seed alfalfa and orchard grass, but expensive seed and no soil moisture seemed questionable, and feed was kind of short in the short term. So we decided we'll try some purple top turnips and oats because that's pretty low seed cost, and got some rain early August and got that started and thought this is something that can work. And since then have expanded using cereal rye to improve weed management, and some years I have used that as an exclusive weed control tool with no-till planted organic soybeans and crimping the rye. Clover frost seeded into wheat, like several other presenters mentioned, suppresses some weed growth, gets us some nitrogen, and mowing that after harvest of the wheat really keeps weeds suppressed and minimal new weed seed production for that year. We can also prevent soil erosion. Depending on your topography, that may be at the top of your list, that may be a secondary benefit or lower concern. Places like I farm on relatively flat land, we can find some 5% slopes, but most of it is 3% or less slope. And we can also improve or increase nutrient availability. Legumes fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. Some of those others can capture manure nutrients that may otherwise be lost to leaching. And we get biodiversity for ecosystem benefits. Some of the blooming nectar producing cover crops can be a host to our beneficial insects, and having living roots in the soil really improves our soil biology. So start off winter hardy cover crops. I've planted a variety of things here. I've got a picture this spring of terminating with a Howard rotavator a mix of winter wheat, hairy vetch, camelina, and I think there was also some rye in there. And that sometimes I'd like to let that get a little bit bigger, but I have learned, as Mike Stites pointed out, with these overwintering cover crops, get a wet spell and they can go from not quite big enough to maximize our benefit to much too big. So I've settled on, if the soil is fit and we've got a bit of growth going, I'm going to kill it sooner rather than later. So the advantages of the winter hardy species is we can plant them later in the fall, and they'll get us some benefit with biomass put on in the spring, and we get some soil protection over the winter and in the early spring. But the downside, we've got to actively terminate them. So this is a tillage pass that I could have skipped if I didn't have a overwintered cover crop if something had winter killed. And then here we've got a picture of some medium red clover that I had frost seeded into winter wheat. This picture is late fall. That's sometime in September. This makes great feed for finishing grass-fed lambs. But I've tried cereal rye. Annual ryegrass has been the spot for that seems to be interseeding into corn at last cultivation. I've done less of that. I did it a couple years, and anywhere I had a poor corn stand, it got me some good grazing forage. Where the corn stand was good, it just barely hung on there, being interseeded at when the corn was about knee high with the last cultivation. I have used winter wheat, winter barley, winter pea, camelina, hairy vetch, crimson clover, and medium red clover. Crimson clover has overwintered for me a couple times, but not extremely consistent here in my location. Clover, they really need to be in at least 6 to 8 weeks before we get our killing frost in the fall, which for me, that's mid-October. I'm hardiness zone 5B. Cereals can be planted much later. I've drilled cereal rye a day or two before the ground froze too hard to get a disc opener in the ground, and had green cover in the spring. Brassica species, ideally we need to get those earlier than the cereals, but can be a little bit later than the clover. And I've actually grown winter canola as a cash crop several times, and mid to late September is my optimal window for that. And that, in a lot of ways, is very similar to dwarf Essex rape that Teresa mentioned, that will overwinter at least some of the time. Now here's a few pictures from soybeans no-till planted into crimped rye. With my crimper is not a proper crimper, it's a old cultimulcher, and so don't always get perfect termination of the rye, but I've just planned a way to work around that. The biggest weakness for me is early germinating annuals like common ragweed and lamb's quarter. If the rye is a little bit thin, some of those will emerge early and then enjoy the light access that the rolled rye gives. But in this case, there's a few weeds in those soybeans, but a level that I can live with there, considering I had no field operations after the day of planting. And this was in a wet year. I had a lot of prevented planting that year, 2019. These soybeans were planted into this rye despite it being too wet. Didn't really matter that it was too wet at cultivating time. So, and yield was right about average here. A dry spring and summer is where the crimped rye system has its biggest weakness. The rye uses a substantial amount of soil moisture to establish and get 6 feet tall. If we don't catch some June and July rain to replenish that, the soybeans can really suffer. And now I'm going to jump to warm season annual species. This picture is a mixture of buckwheat, pearl millet, and sunn hemp, which I seeded the buckwheat here was about 45 pounds to the acre, about 7 pounds of the sunn hemp, and about 4 pounds of the pearl millet. And I actually seeded this for buckwheat seed harvest. And this was an experiment patch that I did have some Canada thistle pressure in, so I wanted a little denser canopy than just the buckwheat. And I wanted a little bit of nitrogen credit, hopefully for the next crop, was the reason to include the sunn hemp. And if I were to do this again, I'd back off on the pearl millet rate. It reduced buckwheat yield more than I would have liked to, whereas the other part of the field, I'd seeded sunn hemp and buckwheat alone, just those two species, and buckwheat yield was substantially similar to where I had buckwheat alone. And as a grazing mix, I have used similar except much lower buckwheat rate, and also included a hybrid brassica, that leafy type, and been very pleased with grazing this as especially a window for grazing around the time of first frost. Pearl millet doesn't have the prussic acid poisoning risk like sorghum, sedans, or sedan grass do when they've been impacted by a frost. So I have used that pearl millet as a grazing species as well. And actually there was some regrowth after buckwheat harvest, and my mother ran her cattle on that for a little while. But the species I've grown in these warm season mixes, I've tried buckwheat, sunflower, cowpea, sunn hemp, pearl millet, sedan grass, hybrid brassicas, soybean, leftover soybean seed. That works. I try to not use species that are in the cash crop rotation in the cover crop mixes. And legumes, sunn hemp, cowpea is another suitable warm season annual. Not to say anything against that, but I've shifted to the sunn hemp. The advantage is I specifically picked species for my mix here that either would not set seed, or if they did, like if the pearl millet did set seed, it's enough different in size that it could be screened out of the buckwheat, because I wanted to make sure I had buckwheat to sell either to a seed, either as seed, or this year it's going to a miller. And cowpea or soybean has the potential to have seed that could be difficult to clean out of the buckwheat. Here's some more pictures of warm season mixes. On the left, that is most of what you see is Piper sedan grass. The picture in the lower right are all the species that were in that mix. There was buckwheat, sedan grass, a hybrid brassica, soybean, two species I didn't want, velvet leaf and Jimson weed. Those are two things that are in my seed bank. They will grow up, and they do have a great root system. They're trying to be a cover crop. I just don't want them to multiply. So I try to get that grazed down or mowed before those set seed. And then on the right, there's sunflower and some volunteer wheat. This was seeded late July after winter wheat harvest, and those are mature cows grazing that in October. And the top right is a similar mix that was seeded in early July on acres that were too wet to plant. Intention was to plant corn that year, and spring did not allow that, so shifted, and mid-July seeded this mixture. Most of the growth is sorghum sedan grass, and that was a field that had some significant areas of moderate Canada thistle pressure, and those thistles were mowed in June before they set seed, and then tilled in and planted that sorghum sedan grass that was allowed to grow until it was cut there the first week of September. And then the following year I rotated to corn, and I have not seen Canada thistle in that field except for where it tries to creep back in from the fence rows since then. So it was very effective. Not every time will sorghum sedan completely eliminate them, but it definitely dramatically reduces their vigor and density. So with those warm season annuals, the optimum time to plant for me is mid-July to early August. Once we get past this first week of August, we're short enough on warm days that it seems better to shift to some other species. So it needs to follow a winter cereal grain or an overwintering oilseed. So I've seeded warm season annuals after harvesting winter canola, winter wheat, winter rye, or even spring oats. We have a little bit of a window there, but they're not coming off till late July, where those others come off early July. We can grow some tremendous amounts of biomass, which if we have a use for forage, either grazing or harvested, they have some great opportunity there. Buckwheat also is an excellent nectar source for beneficial insects. Soybean aphids were mentioned earlier. Whether it's just my luck and coincidence, but since I've started incorporating buckwheat into my cover crop mixes, I have seen very few soybean aphids, but a significant increase in beneficial insects and aphid predators like lacewings and hoverflies. Now, I will note buckwheat, especially when grown for seed production, there will be some volunteer buckwheat. Here you see strips of where it's thicker, that's right behind the combine, whether that was shatter out of the swath, since I swathed a week before threshing, or light seed that blew out the back of the combine. And then we had a late frost this year. I had actually drilled rye to plan for crimped soybeans the following season. Drilled that rye mid-September. This was approaching the 1st of November, and we had not yet had a frost to kill that buckwheat, so some of it was starting to even bloom a little. I was a little bit concerned it was too competitive with the rye, but it turned out okay. It froze shortly after this, and the buckwheat just melted away. Though there was some volunteer buckwheat then came up in another flush with the soybeans, which ends up being a beneficial insect feeder in the soybeans if it's just a small amount. I'm not worried about a small amount of volunteer buckwheat in soybeans, so long as I don't have a food grade production contract with a buyer for which a bit of buckwheat would be an issue, because there will end up being a small amount of buckwheat in the soybean sample if there's volunteer buckwheat in the soybeans. So now I'll jump to cool season annual species, which most of the time I'm planting these if it's a little bit too late for those warm season species. Kind of the sweet spot for significant biomass accumulation is the second week of August, kind of the 7th to the 15th. We'll get tremendous fall growth, which makes great late fall grazing. So this was seeded the first week of August, a mixture of oats, 4010 peas, and Winfred hybrid brassica. And you can see this is later October. The corn across the road there is brown, but not yet harvested. And truck there gives a little reference for how tall that is. And this forage will hold quality well into November. It'll start once you get down lows in the 20s, it'll start to wilt down. But good late fall grazing. I've used 4010 peas. I've used barley instead of oats sometimes. Hybrid brassicas, turnips, mustard. So here, talked about timing. Spring planting, we can put them on in the spring, though to get significant growth and accumulation, if we've got a legume there, we really need to delay termination till late May, which starts pushing my cash crop planting date pretty late. But we can grow a lot of biomass, raise those. So here's an example of spring planted. This is a mixture of 4010P, oat, and mustard. And the picture on the left, this was broadcast and disked into corn stalks mid-March. And photo on the left was the 5th of May. On the right was the 19th of May. I terminated it a couple days later and planted sunflowers the first week of June. And that worked fairly well, but I really prefer the extra growth from, or the same amount of growth from, a fall planted overwintering mix that I could terminate 2 weeks earlier at the same growth stage. And there's my contact information and my crew that helps me out, but also is why I can't do everything I dream of on the farm, because the people are more important. And there, do we have questions that you'd like to ask?
Yeah. So thank you, Paul. One thing is, what is your kind of last plan of cover crops there? What is one cover crop that you just want it to work, but it's just not quite working, and then one that worked surprisingly well?
Okay, one that I've wanted to work that hasn't quite. Winter peas are one of those things that crimson clover is the one that comes to mind. It's not reliable enough for me to count on it.
Okay.
But I would like it to work. And I said one that wouldn't do without, or
Yep.
I mean, the one that every year some goes in somewhere is cereal rye.
Mm-hmm.
If I've got late corn harvest, I can put some cereal rye in, and I know it's going to come through the winter.
Yeah. Are you trying anything new, like a different kind of mix or different cover crop this coming season?
So different kind of mix. I did this year. I tried. It's not a mix, but I'm trying some winter barley as a cover crop, where I'm rotating from soybeans back to corn, and I want to have something to retain the nutrients from my fall manure application and give some soil cover over the winter, but I don't want the aggressive spring growth of cereal rye and risk too much nitrogen tie up for my corn crop. That's a first time trying that. And then, like I mentioned in my slideshow, mixing some cover crop species with a seed crop like the buckwheat. That's something I'm excited about. Trying to fine tune that mix to optimize my cover crop benefit and still get that full or close to full buckwheat yield. So I'm thinking the next time around to try some short, lower growing broadleaf, like maybe a turnip or brassica type, turnip or other shorter growing brassica species.
Okay. Yeah, interesting there. I was surprised, like anytime you mention you like buckwheat or anything, it's anytime I recommend it. It's always one of those things that make sure you always recommend it can become weedy if you let it go to you don't get it terminate before flowering and everything.
Yes, it can. My first year growing buckwheat, I had like 5 pounds to the acre in a mix that with oats, peas, and a hybrid brassica for fall grazing. And there was some buckwheat that went to seed. I was like, oh, not a big deal. I'm going to get a flush of that. I'm going to plant the corn late May. I'll have a flush come up. I'll till it, and it'll be fine. That was kind of an experiment strip, 7 acres on the edge of a 30-acre field. And most of the field was frost-seeded clover and wheat. So then the next spring, we had early spring, warm conditions. It was the 30th of April, great weather forecast. I thought, I'll get started and I'll plant this field to corn. And as I'm planting the field, I texted one of my friends, organic farmer friend, and he's like, everybody I know that plants organic corn early regrets it. I'm like, yeah, and I start going through the checklist of why this is a low weed pressure field. We have a perfect forecast. It's going to be fine. And then I remembered that buckwheat that I had forgotten about, and I had started on that side of the field.
Oh,
and so if I had started on the side that was clover and I hadn't quite got there yet, I probably would have stopped and said, well, we'll plant that later. But too late. So a week later, I had buckwheat coming up so thick, and I rotary hoed it as hard as I could, and I killed about half of it with the rotary hoe, but I still had a lot of buckwheat. And then I cultivated it when the corn was like 3 leaf, as tight as I could, and I still had more buckwheat plant than corn. I thought, well, this is a mess. But it was only the 3rd week of May. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to just replant that. I'm planting other organic corn right now anyway. It's kind of my ideal window. And a mentor of mine said, don't replant it all, learn something. And so I did leave a little bit of a check. And once the corn got about knee high, it stopped looking purple. And we had good rain that summer. It turned out I couldn't find a substantial yield difference between the replanted area and the area that had the volunteer buckwheat in it, though I did notice my corn ears would jump from where the volunteer buckwheat had been. They'd be 16 rows around at the base and 14 at the tip. Like the plants were reacting to the stress of the competition when they were determining their ear size. If we had less than perfect growing conditions, probably wouldn't have turned out so well. And the thing that I'm glad that happened was it reminded me to be aware of that issue of some species can be a weed problem, but also that was a year I saw so many hoverflies feeding on the buckwheat blooms, and thought, well, if this is how I can get those beneficials, we'll find ways to strategically have some blooming buckwheat here and there, just not that much. And another related anecdote, that replanted corn where there had been thick volunteer buckwheat with some of the cleanest corn I've ever had. And I've noticed several times since having a flush of volunteer buckwheat come up and then tilling it in seems to have an effect on reducing weed germination for a short window there. So
yeah, that's very interesting. It seems like it's kind of inspiring too. I like that your mentor there kind of said, just save a little spot here just to check, because I don't know, it's coming. I would probably be the one like, no, I just don't want to look at it. I'll admit that I screwed up there. I just want to get rid of that and not look at it anymore. But it looks like you turned what was negative into a positive, and you learned from that experience.
Yeah, that's often mistakes are tuition in the school of life, and I never feel like the money's wasted if I learn something from it. So saving a little bit of the lesson to gather as much data as I can is kind of a trick. And I see several comments came in that a flamer would be very effective on the buckwheat. And at that time, I did not have a flamer. Now that I have a flamer, I have seen at least buckwheat less than a couple inches tall just is one of the easiest things to kill with flame. So that's something. So now that I have a flamer in my toolbox, I'm not very concerned about volunteer buckwheat and corn. I've got a way to clean it out. And if I've got one volunteer buckwheat for every 10 feet of corn row, I'm not concerned about that at all.
Oh yeah, good. Have you done another comment said about zapping as well? Have you ever done some weed zapping in there, or just more rely on flaming?
So flaming, I'm pretty much only using that on, well, mostly using that on corn. A few circumstances I've flamed soybean just as they're at emergent while they're still protected by the soil. But as far as zapping, I don't have a zapper, and as of yet, there's few custom zappers that would come to my area. However, in my soybeans, my main weed escape after cultivation is velvet leaf, and zapper operators have reported mixed results on velvet leaf. So I've used walking crews, and so haven't seen zapping on buckwheat, but I've heard that and I would, from how juicy of a stem buckwheat has, I could see it being quite susceptible.